success was social media and the effective use of social media. Can you reflect on what role social media is playing in either the democratization or the threats to democracy in Southeast Asia?
Pros and cons. I mean, pros is that during the campaign, for example, we could reach our constituencies easier. We could do our campaign management and strategic communication easier. But the threat is the misuse of social media, information operation, fake news and all those things to, assassinate characters. And that's also the negative side of it. And I think it's time for governments to start thinking about transparency of algorithms when it comes to social media, because it will become more polarized and more polarized. Once you hit on that clip, it will automatically lead to more clips about that situation, and then it could get worse. More than social media, asking for transparency when it comes to algorithm, so that everybody can know what kind of algorithm they do to us and to our children. I'm thinking about artificial intelligence now, because social media is quite yesterday when it comes to politics and campaign management. Is about artificial intelligence and politics. How do you think about this, and what's the morality, what's the moral compass on how you use artificial intelligence in politics? That's more of the right question on the next campaign going forward.
Anna, I'm going to jump over to you. You're a law scholar. We've seen constitutional courts play a key role in recent Southeast Asian politics, including Indonesia and now in Thailand, as Kun Peter talked about. What effect are these courts having on democracy, and to what extent are they promoting democracy?
Thank you, and thank you for having a lawyer join this conversation. I really appreciate the opportunity. So yeah, we've already heard some examples of how courts are getting increasingly involved in politics, and this is something that's happening not just in Southeast Asia, it's happening everywhere. The lawyers call it judicialization of politics. And, courts can play a positive role in this space. Having the option to take action in court under a constitution and hold leaders accountable under that constitution is an important part of democratic governance. And there are examples of that happening in the region. But there are other ways that democratic role has really become very limited. So one limitation is the quality of the law itself, right? Courts apply the law, and if the law is not democratic, that limits what the court can do with it. So some courts will get around this. They'll interpret the Constitution and they'll say this law is an invalid law. And we have an example of that from Indonesia earlier this year, where there was a law that kind of criminalized fake news and defamation. And the Constitutional Court said, well, that's unconstitutional because it's being used to criminalize freedom of speech, and target critics of the government. So we see a positive role that the court plays there. But on the other hand, we see courts becoming increasingly politicized. So also in Indonesia, we hear examples of courts favouring one side of politics over the other in different ways. One example, of course, is the decision of the Constitutional Court to remove the age barrier on presidential candidates, which opened the way for Jokowi's son to run for vice president in the recent election. So, and that case also raises a third issue, which I think is the degree to which courts are close to political interests or other elite interests like business interests or the military. So in that case, it was particularly controversial because the Chief Justice who sat on this case was actually Jokowi's brother-in-law. And of course, that Chief Justice was later demoted for violation of the ethics code, but the decision still stands. So I think that another limitation we see in the region is this closeness between courts and judges to those who are in power. Thanks.
Sim, I'm going to jump to you and ask you how trends in democratic erosion or growth in the region impact minority communities, and Can you give us some examples of what might be happening in the Philippines?
Yeah. Overall, I think the impact for minorities and marginalized group broadly has been quite detrimental insofar as those who seek to advance more authoritarian interests often move towards weakening institutions that are supposed to safeguard the rights of minorities, leaving them much more vulnerable to discrimination, but also abuse. And some have also resorted to rhetoric that vilify certain communities, blaming them as the sources of society's problem. And certainly that's what we've seen how it's played out in the context of the Philippines under the presidency of former President Rodrigo Duterte, who openly kind of disparaged human rights and championed a war on drugs that kind of built upon that rhetoric of homogenizing drug users as this dangerous others that needed to be dealt with. And we saw the detrimental impacts that had in terms of thousands of drug users being killed, majority of whom come from urban poor communities, so communities that are already in positions of vulnerability economically, socially, and politically as well. And I think that that's how it's played out in the context of the Philippines, but certainly the patterns of marginalization can also be seen in other contexts and on the basis of other identities, whether that's religious minorities, ethnic minorities, as well as gender identities as well. And I think what's worse as well in the context of democratic erosion is that usually it comes hand in hand with a crackdown on dissenting voices, which makes it even harder for people who are from marginalized groups that already face political barriers to keep fighting for their rights and to seek justice for their rights as well.
Thank you. Hong, I'm going to bring you back to some of the points that Kun Peter was making about the role of multilateral organisations like ASEAN and whether they have a role in facilitating democratic and accountable governance.
Thank you, Michael. ASEAN, obviously, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations that define the region, which we talk about 10 Southeast Asian nations. But in fact, by nature and design, is not to interfere with domestic politics. And the region which we know now, the 10 ASEAN countries, are actually designed to encompass different differences. So before the enlargement, before Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, Myanmar joined, it's, of course, was very diverse as well, but there was more commonality, arguably, to the ASEAN than it is now. So by design, it is accommodating those illiberal forms of governments and as accepted forms of governments in ASEAN. And because of that, it is bind to that non-interference, it is bind to embracing that diversity. And in fact, the applying member, who is not yet a formal member, Timor-Leste, of all countries comparatively in different indexes and accountability, has the best record in terms of democracy performance. So it is not to jump to conclusions that ASEAN is not really facilitating democratic governance, but there is that diversity that very few things that ASEAN nations can agree on these days because of that, those political differences at the foundation. In fact, if there's one thing that they agree on is not to interfere in domestic politics. That is something guarded by each and every individual. So it would be not welcome for ASEAN and institutions like that to facilitate, changes in democratic, in domestic policies, politics and governance. There are initiatives that ASEAN has, and there are some more successful than others. Of course, the criticism about ASEAN as institution has been since the day one of its existence. To paraphrase a way of describing ASEAN, institution is a shadow of a man, and men who are ruling ASEAN, unlike what we would want to see, like Kun Pita, who has energy and ideas, there is a lot of acceptance to rituals, to things that are common and comfortable, not necessarily advancing processes, not necessarily future looking. So that's why all the reforms that Kunpita mentioned had been in discussion for years in how to modernize ASEAN, but they go against the habits, the ritual, the comfortable way of doing business in ASEAN. So this is to say that ASEAN is not there. That's not the purpose of ASEAN. But there are things that ASEAN can do. For example, Kunpita also mentioned about the environmental initiatives. There are things that ASEAN does and does relatively well. For example, dialogues on advancing rights of women, children, minorities, migrants. These are things that ASEAN can do in terms of accountability. And in general, I think providing that opportunity and platform for transparency, dialogue, and of course, continuous commitment of ASEAN leaders to certain norms and standards of governance. And that is something very difficult because that commitment needs to be continuous and ongoing, which is not necessarily the case as we see in the current performance.
Anna, the variation in regime type that Huang was talking about, does that affect ASEAN's ability to act as a unitary and effective actor in places like the South China Sea and Myanmar?
Yeah. I think Huang's sort of answered some of this question already. I think it's an interesting question to think about because in the abstract, I don't think the differences in regime type necessarily matter when it comes to a country's foreign policy, right? You can think about democracies working with non-democracies, where their interests align. So it shouldn't, in the abstract be a barrier. The trick and the question is to find where those interests align. And, if you've got the complexity of the problems that Kunpita outlined in relation to South China Sea and Myanmar, you've clearly got interests that align. I mean, peace in Myanmar is critical, but, this how to get there problem comes up. So I think it's a very difficult question to answer, but Myanmar, I think it's said a lot, is the test case for ASEAN, and taking some of the steps that Peter outlined in his talk might help get there. But I think, I guess another part of the problem is, countries that act in national interest, but also where self-interest and the self-interest of those elites in particular countries come into play. So we can all say, well, peace in Myanmar is in the national interest of every country, but is it in the interests of elites in various other countries who want to support the military, who want to promote their own business interests? So it's not just about governance. I think it's more than that. And regime type is one factor, but not the only one. Sorry, that's a non-answer to a difficult question. Thank you.
Kunpita, did you want to comment on that, or you were nodding vigorously?
Bullseye. Personal connection over institutional politics is part of the difficulty of how you move. But then I started with hopeful message that, it might be hard in terms of the infrastructure or the hard side of things. But then again, if you have the soft side of, cultural intervention, then it might be possible. But the thing is, you need a change of leadership in the sense that you look forward in how you do things, not how you look in the past. Otherwise, it's either you disrupt yourself or you be disrupted.
I'm going to go off script here, and I'm going to go to where Kunpita started his remarks, and on the youth of the region, the fact that Southeast Asia is a very young region and that it's got young leaders. So I'm going to ask Huang and Sim and Betty each to comment on whether the youth of the region is a force for democratisation. Is this something we should be hopeful about? Why don't you start us off, Huang?
It's a very difficult question. I think it also really depends on, how do we define democracy really? Because we sort of have an idea that a democracy is a goal, we've reached it and it's all good. But actually it's an ongoing exercise. Even, the most shining liberal democracies are struggling with new challenges and new waves of challenges, including technology, which very proliferated among young people, but necessarily also introducing disruption, including social divisions, polarization, and whatnot. So even in mature democracies, this continues to be challenging. So I think with the environment in Southeast Asia was never really conducive to the type of liberal democracy that we have often in mind. I think there would be a double whammy challenge. One being obviously, the certain inherited patterns, be them the dynastic politics, patronage, and all kind of entrenched issues that deep running. And on the other hand, the new challenges that are coming, and we don't necessarily have any either solution or answer to that. And so we have both a regulation in terms of information because of the more authoritarian tendencies, but also lack of regulation when it comes to social media and technology. So those young people will be growing up in a very challenging environment, very hard to distinguish which norms, which way to go about, and how to exercise the democratic rights if they get there, and how to promote that. So I think it's going to be if anything, it's more bumpy road ahead. I am also hopeful, like Kun Pita, when it comes to the potential of the region. And I think if we talk about democracy, we certainly have to talk about the developmentalism in Southeast Asia, and it's not by chance that Kun Pita started with economy and economic potential of the region. But does that necessarily translate into the form of governance, in the form of liberal democracy that we have known in the past decades? I think there's going to be a new form forming, some hybrid forms, more challenges ahead, and it would be up to young people to navigate. And I don't think it's going to be the answers that we had in the previous exercise